name's Rachel, and I'm here to talk about the current situation regarding reproductive rights in the United States. I particularly want to talk about some shortcomings and some inconsistencies that gradually I've realized exist through some time spent as a reproductive rights advocate. And these have become more and more obvious to me, culminating with the research I did for this presentation. So this is new information for me as well as maybe for some of you. So for me, and I think for many, particularly young white middle-class activists, pro-choice was a rallying cry for what got us started in activism, what got us started becoming feminists. It was where I first got involved in organizing. I started volunteering for the Planned Parenthood in Orlando, Florida, where I went to school. As a sophomore in college, I was doing clinic escorting, volunteering in the office, doing campus organizing, so phone banks and rallies and fundraising and lobby days in Tallahassee and that kind of thing. So I went on to be, for 2 years, a community health educator at that Planned Parenthood affiliate, which means that I taught sexual and reproductive health, STDs, and basic contraception in mainly public middle and high schools, but also juvenile detention centers and mental institutions and colleges and really anywhere that would book us for anything. But I also continued doing the political advocacy work, so those sort of liberal advertising or organizing tactics that I started out with as a younger college student. In January of this year, Planned Parenthood ceased using the word choice in their outreach and promotional materials. And they found through a lot of focus grouping, they're a really big nonprofit, so they have the money to do those kinds of things, that the word choice and the term pro-choice no longer resonated, especially with young people. They justify this. Cecile Richards, the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood, says that people now see abortion as a complex, deeply personal issue that can't be summed up by the words pro-choice. But criticism of the use of the word choice as a framework for the fight for abortion access is not new. It's been around for a while, most notably headed up by women of color, reproductive activists, who quite rightfully pointed out that the choice framework does not do the actual terms of the fight justice. The complexity and the expansiveness of reproductive control in this country and others has a lot more to it than just abortion. So we have kind of tunnel vision now for this one particular access and right, but there's a lot more than that. So the Reproductive Justice Collective Sister Song says that their use of the term reproductive justice instead represents a shift for women advocating for control of their bodies from a narrower focus on legal access and individual choice, the focus of mainstream organizations like Planned Parenthood, to a broader analysis of racial, economic, cultural, and structural constraints on our power. So this move to abandon choice caused a lot of hand-wringing among liberal pundits and advocates, as though, a lot of people were phrasing it as though abandoning the term choice was equal to materially taking choices away from women, when really it was just shifting of a talking point. So that's one thing I want to talk about in this presentation, is how the talking points we use are not just talking points. They're not just the conversation. They inform our tactics and what we're actually doing in a material sense in the real world. And this move away from choice really puzzled me at the time. It wasn't that long ago, but I was confused. I could not at first figure out why they would have done that. And the background to that is that I think, pro-choice was a kind of like rallying cry for me and the activists in my position that I got kind of brought up with as a feminist. Those women I met, some of the most dedicated and just extraordinary advocates for reproductive justice and choice, however they want to phrase it, during that period of my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I don't think we should sugarcoat what the use of that talking point actually means in terms of our tactics. And that's what I want to talk about today. That questioning of whether choice was a useful framework for this fight was kind of the first crack in a narrative that was really familiar to me. And that, in a very kind of short time, has led me to go back and analyze all of the narrative that we're using, not just that talking point, but the entire story that we tell ourselves surrounding this fight and other fights for reproductive justice. So liberal reproductive rights advocates are operating on a set of premises that are often unspoken, and when they are spoken, they're usually largely unexamined. So these premises make up a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I think that all of these, every component of this has pretty much gone off the rails. It doesn't have a lot of correspondence with the actual reality of the situation at this point. And I think one effect of this false narrative is that the tactics we're using are not working. We are losing this fight in almost every measurable sense, and this accelerates by the day. So, to use a phrase from my third wave education, I want to problematize this narrative with some subjugated knowledge. Or, in real people talk, I want to bring up some information that we don't normally talk about, with the goal of trying to shift our strategy towards something that could actually begin to work. So here's the story that gets told. Before Roe versus Wade, abortion was illegal, and women were either forced to resort to dangerous and unreliable self-abortion, or put their lives in the hands of back alley butchers, unqualified men who exploited women's lack of other options. The passage of Roe v. Wade gave America's women the right and opportunity to plan for their families and control their reproductive health. That's another Cecile Richards quote. Today, conservative politicians are restricting abortion access due to religious zealotry, medical misinformation, and regressive ideas about the role of women in society. In the end, we can successfully combat these restrictions through legal, electoral, legislative, lobbying, and public education tactics. So I want to look critically at each part of this and see what we might be leaving out. Each part of this narrative is a kind of half-truth, but unfortunately the stakes are way too high to only follow our logic halfway to its conclusion. So 87% of counties in the US have no abortion provider. This especially defines rural counties. The ones that do have it are usually large urban areas. In 2012 alone, 43 abortion restrictions were enacted in 19 states. Outright bans are illegal under Roe. That's the one thing, we're going to talk about that Roe actually did. The 4 states have bans in waiting, which means that if Roe were overturned, and there are a lot of forces out there that would like nothing better than for Roe to be overturned, those bans would go into effect immediately. 14 additional states have bans on the books from before Roe was passed, and if it was overturned, these could go back into effect pretty easily. 32 states have biased counseling laws where doctors are required to give their patients false information, like the assertion that abortion increases the risk of breast cancer, suicide, depression, anorexia, infertility, among other things. Or emotionally manipulative information, like the idea that the unborn child has the physical structures necessary to experience pain. This is Arkansas and Georgia. That is not medically defensible in any literature that actually exists. Biased counseling laws are often coupled with mandatory waiting periods, in which after the doctor tells you those lies, you're forced to go and contemplate them for a minimum of 24 and a maximum of 72 hours before having to make a separate doctor's appointment to go back and get the actual procedure. So if you live several hours from your provider, this is a major hardship. 8 states have mandatory ultrasound laws. So 2 of these require that the ultrasound image be shown to the woman, and if she looks away, that's okay because the doctor is required to describe them to you. Some of these mandatory ultrasounds are transvaginal ultrasounds, so penetration is required in order for you to get an abortion. Attacks on access include insurance bans like the Hyde Amendment. So in the US, we have a totally commercialized healthcare system. Many women that are lower income rely on Medicaid. No Medicaid money can go to funding abortions. And this means that the accessibility is greatly decreased for women who do not have economic means and privilege. And 45 states have trap laws, which are the main reason that 87% of counties do not have abortion providers. Because trap laws are one of the sneakiest things that they've come up with. They are basically red tape. They're kind of sideways laws that don't outright ban abortion, don't make any moral judgment about it, but they make it bureaucratically impossible for clinics to stay open. So some of them require that the hallways be the width that they're required for emergency facilities, even though abortion clinics do not have to be emergency facilities in any practical sense. Some of them require that the doctors need to have admitting privileges at the local hospital, which are very difficult to attain, especially if you're an abortion provider. So these, I think, are one of the main sort of newer and more creative ways that clinics are getting shut down. So let's start at the beginning. Before Roe versus Wade, the story says abortion was illegal. So it's true that Roe v. Wade federally ended the outright criminalization of abortion. But it's not very often acknowledged that the criminalization of abortion in the US had a beginning as well as an end. The beginning of reproductive control by powerful European men on this continent began well before the official birth of the United States. It began with the first day of colonization. So many indigenous cultures here and elsewhere practice a variety of traditional ways of regulating birth and abortion. The genocide of peoples means the erasure of their traditional knowledge, which included those methods for performing abortion. So the ongoing systematic rape of indigenous women on this continent and others further curtails any environmental or any reproductive control that they would have had. So this is going to come up over and over. When we talk about reproductive laws, we need to talk about rape. People have brought up that politicians seem unable to contain themselves from talking about rape when they're talking about reproductive laws. And there's a reason for that. We need to put that in context through every step of this. So starting in the 1600s, captured Africans sold as slaves were denied any and all reproductive control. Female slaves and later freed African women were denied and are denied reproductive control in every sense. So they saw both forced birth and forced sterilization and abortion. And this continues up until today. North Carolina's last admitted forcible sterilization was in 1974. In June of 2012, victims that brought a class action lawsuit were denied any compensation. Last week, it came out that in California penitentiaries, 2 of them that's been proven, at least 148 women were sterilized without consent. So this has not stopped in any way. So, when we're examining the mainstream reproductive rights movement, it's reasonable and necessary to point out that we focus on abortion with a kind of tunnel vision. And this presentation is going to do that too, because that's the narrative I'm critiquing. But at every stage, we need to recognize that that's just one part of a much larger problem. So back to history. In contrast, as you brought up, European colonists, the women of the colonizers, were legally allowed abortion. Now, individual women were controlled very heavily by the men in their lives, whether it was their husband or their fathers, in an individual sense. But legally, abortion was not outlawed. The point when abortion became unacceptable, most amazingly to me, was called the quickening. So that's the woman's experience of the first time she feels the fetus move inside her womb. So in contrast to everything we know about reproductive regulation today, this was based on the woman's word and her experience. And there were abortion methods. Many of these were herbal, could be easily grown. These were not always safe, let's not sugarcoat it, but they were controlled by women and they were not outlawed. Midwives, non-licensed, there was no licensing at that point, but female practitioners of traditional medicine had a large role in particularly the reproductive aspects of health. So in the 1820s, states began outlawing abortion, and then, as in now, these laws were couched in religious language. But these laws also mirrored rising fears that racial and religious minorities would become the majority of the U.S. And this idea still sends shivers down the spines of our white male politicians as much as it did then. So in 1868, Horatio R. Storer was one of the leading anti-abortion crusaders of this time. He's quoted as saying, "Will the West be filled by our own children or by those of aliens? This is a question our women must answer. Upon their loins depends the future destiny of the nation." Well, unfortunately, Horatio and his compatriots were not satisfied to leave this up to women or their loins. They decided to take this into their own hands. So in the late 1800s, the AMA, the American Medical American Medical Association, is quoted as saying this: "The frightful extent of abortion in the U.S. is found in the grave defects of our laws, both common and statute, as regards the independent and actual existence of the child before birth as a living being. These errors, which are sufficient in most instances to prevent conviction, are based and only based upon mistaken and exploded medical dogmas." So the AMA was then an entirely male-controlled institution, and they were the main lobbyists to criminalize abortion during this time. So isn't it convenient that if abortion is not based on the needs or desires of women, but on medical misunderstanding, then as the newly knighted medical elite, they were the only ones qualified to correct this grave misunderstanding that led to the necessity of abortion. So by 1900, every state has abortion criminalization on the books, and the AMA was a big part of this. So this was a bid for control, plain and simple. They wanted to be the only ones that had the knowledge about abortion, and they wanted to be the only ones with the legal authority to perform it. And they got their way. That's what we see happening today. So there's a lot of information and analysis out there about the medicalization of birth. Anyone seen The Business of Being Born? Good, maybe watch it if you haven't seen it. But hand in hand with that came the medicalization of abortion. It wasn't just birth, it was female anatomy and human reproduction in general that became medicalized and therefore institutionalized. And the parts of that process that were controlled by women were criminalized. It was criminalized for them to be in control, to have that control. So the practice of medicine as a whole went from a more community-based structure with midwives and no licensing, practitioners that accumulated knowledge through traditional ways and through handed down. That went away. And what we ended up with gradually was a commercialized, industrialized medical industry that was very different from that. So this process, both with birth and abortion, increased male control and decreased female autonomy was the net result of that. So this doesn't really make as much sense, or at least it leaves out a lot of the story. So as usual, the actual truth is a lot more complicated and less catchy than the talking point. But this is more like what actually happened. For the European men who colonized this continent, reproductive control of women has always been a part of colonization and enslavement. Starting in the early 1800s, the government began using the law to restrict white women's access to abortion in order to ensure a white Protestant majority. The newly forming commercial medical industry collaborated in this effort in order to ensure their own control of abortion information and practice. So on to the next part. Back then, women were either forced to resort to dangerous and unreliable self-induced abortion, or put their lives in the hands of back alley butchers, unqualified men who exploited women's lack of other option. The back alley butcher is kind of the boogeyman of the reproductive rights movement. He gets referenced a lot, and I think it's important to put that narrative in context as a story with a political purpose, not something that's necessarily based on, time-tested, objective truth. So we hear this part of the narrative all the time. A typical example from an article recently with the 40th anniversary of Roe. Before this landmark decision, abortions were completely illegal, and desperate women had to resort to unsafe back alley procedures, many of which resulted in their deaths. So right off the bat, this premise erases a lot of women. It erases women like Ruth Barnett, who for many years in Portland, Oregon, operated an illegal but very safe and cutting edge in terms of medical technology clinic by making friends in the community, by paying off police, by people realizing that she performed a necessary service. She got arrested. She was harassed and criminalized through a lot of her career, but she did not stop. And we need to acknowledge that she was not a back alley butcher, and she performed in the illegal era. It also erases women like the Jane Collective. Anyone read that book, The Story of Jane? That book blew my mind because it was women taking that power and that ability and that knowledge of how to perform abortion back. They operated a floating illegal abortion clinic in Chicago during the years directly preceding the Roe decision. And they also were harassed and criminalized for doing what they did. But they had a complication rate equal to the medical practitioners of abortion at that time. But that doesn't erase the fact that this part of the narrative does have some truth to it. There are many, many accounts of women being forced to go to unqualified practitioners that led to septic abortions, which are often fatal in that time. Often women were forced to resort to self-abortion, which still, being a sex ed teacher, has not gone away and is still just as dangerous. It was hangers then, it's drinking bleach now, but it's still there. So this is still true. But the evidence tells us that the scariness and the lethalness of illegal abortion is played out beyond what the evidence tells us. So we have Ricky Solinger, who wrote the book Beggars and Choosers, which, if you're interested in this topic, is another really good one to read. She wrote, "Of course, women did tragically die in the illegal era, and the incidence of death plummeted to near zero after legalization. But it was not simply luck that attended the hundreds of thousands of other women in the so-called back alley each year. The fact is, an uncountable but very large number of competent practitioners performed abortions even then." So legality is not the key to safety, necessarily, is what we should take away from this. So we have to ask, what political purpose is served by the common invocation of this boogeyman, the back alley butcher, today? Why has this narrative lived on, and what political purpose does it serve? So if it's not as lethal as it's made out to be in the illegal era, why does this persist? Why do we keep talking about it this way? And we have Ricky Solinger again. The back alley butcher presupposes a simple, bifurcated historical narrative. Before Roe v. Wade, abortion was deadly dangerous. Afterward, it was safe and legal. So this simple dichotomy sets women up with a false choice. Do you want the exploitative man in the back alley, or do you want the exploitative man in the white coat? I mean, no room for actual choice in this false choice. And it masks the real problem, which is the fact that that desperation has followed women into the legal era, because the source of that desperation was not eradicated by the legalization of abortion. The source of that desperation is the fact that the medical industry and the legal industry, the government, collaborated to remove women's access to self-determination and bodily autonomy. And this is as true today as it was in the pre-Roe era. So this doesn't really add up the way that we tell it either. Again, a kernel of truth, but a lot left out in order to make that the dogma that we repeat today. More true is that during the illegal era, the medicalization and criminalization of abortion worked together, hand in hand, to force women into a desperate position where they remain today. So I can remember holding a sign with a hanger in an X that said, "Never go back." A lot of us probably can remember that, because I can remember being really fired up as a 19-year-old, 18-year-old, 17-year-olds at those protests, thinking, we're never going to go back to the era that our parents or grandparents were in, where they were forced into this desperate position. But the idea of never going back loses all meaning when you realize that only a very few of us ever got the opportunity to leave. Time and time again, working as a sex educator, I taught middle and high school girls, and most classes, most months, I would get a girl who either could not access birth control, needed an abortion, couldn't get one, and did not know what to do about it. Florida has a parental notification law, so the idea of getting kicked out of their house or stigmatized for the rest of their life is not gone. That's still there for them. Even girls who didn't have a chance of getting pregnant at that time, or were not worried about it, were not having that happen to them, would express the terror of that possibility and the wrenching fear that they experience on a daily basis just at the idea that this could possibly happen to them. So never go back, again, loses all meaning when most of us are still there. And I think that the relatively privileged white middle-class activists like myself that carry those signs need to realize that it's only through luck of birthright, luck of privilege, that we were born into a world where we got to leave it all. And we cannot accept that and leave everyone else behind. So Roe has not made abortion more accessible. And this brings us to the next part of the story. So the idea is that the passage of Roe v. Wade gave America's women the right and opportunity to plan for their families and control their reproductive health. So this is Cecile Richards again, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood. The problem is that she's wrong on both counts. Roe does not give women the right to an abortion, and it does not give them the opportunity to an abortion today. So, in fact, an interesting thing I realized after I went back and read the actual text of Roe, which is something in the years I was working in this industry and thinking about it, I never actually did, so only recently I did that. And in the decision, it never references a woman's decision without immediately saying right afterward, a woman and her physician, a woman and her physician, a woman and her physician. And if you put this in the context of the hostile takeover of abortion access and female reproduction in general by the medical industry, this becomes a lot more sinister. And the talking point, safe and legal, which I use all the time, we all use all the time, we want abortion to be safe and legal, becomes a lot more sinister. And it, again, brings to mind the things that we're leaving out by using these kind of talking points. So we hear this a lot today, that abortion is a legal medical procedure, one so common that 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in her lifetime. Each woman faces her own unique situation when deciding whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. Ultimately, though, that decision is about her health care. So read that sentence again, thinking about what's actually happened in terms of the medical industry and abortion. Also, think about the conversation about individualism that we've been having in the last 3 days, and the idea that each woman faces her own unique situation when deciding whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. That's true to an extent, but to a larger extent, it's not. The fact that we all are faced with that fear and that being forced into that decision and that position of desperation is not unique. The terms of it are unique. The specific details of that situation are unique. But the fact that we are forced into that is not unique. And I think claiming that as a class issue is what's missing from a lot of this conversation as well. So it blew my mind when I realized that the National Abortion Rights Action League, which is a pretty big advocacy organization. NARAL is their acronym for reproductive rights. It used to be called the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. Not the reform of abortion laws, the repeal of abortion laws. So they were not advocating for generous or effective regulation of abortion. They understood that as long as men in power had access to that right under their institutional thumbs, it would never be safe. They were advocating for actual reproductive freedom. In that book, The Story of Jane, a demonstration that radical feminists did in the pre-Roe era was hand out their list of ideal abortion regulations, and it was a blank sheet of paper. So we have entirely lost a consciousness of what it would actually mean to advocate for reproductive freedom. We're doing what we can within that system. I am not in any way trying to denigrate the work of women who are working on those laws, who are doing the legal and advocacy and grassroots organizing to do the best that we can within that legal system. But we are groping in the dark if we can't think of the fact that the goal should not be to have them regulate us in a generous way. It should be that they don't get to regulate us at all. That in and of itself is a loss of control. And if we accept that regulation by the medical industry of abortion is the best we can do, we accept failure. So Roe also left, to me this is one of the most terrifying parts of the research for this presentation. It left one door to the total criminalization of abortion wide open. And it did not take long for the law to force its way through that door. So the text of the decision in the preamble says, the available precedent persuades us that the word person, as used in the 14th Amendment, does not include the unborn. If this suggestion of personhood is established, the appellant, Roe's, case, of course, collapses. For the fetus right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the amendment. Let's think about that for a second. So it hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized that if fetuses are granted personhood, it doesn't matter what the law says, women are denied personhood. There is no two ways about it. There's no compromise here. It's a zero-sum game. If we can accept that the possibility of life is more of a person than a living, breathing female person, then it's over. We have no legal precedent to stand on it. This puts it very explicitly what could happen and what has happened. This is not something that could possibly happen in the future. This is what we're seeing today. So this ruling set the stage for several personhood law attempts we've seen recently. While I was in school, it got defeated in Mississippi, which was a really exciting victory for us because, hey, Mississippi, you would think if it could pass anywhere, it would be there, but it didn't. Unfortunately, it was passed in North Dakota. And the first precedent for fetuses being defined as persons is behind us. This is now the ground that we're standing on. So as weak as the protection of Roe really is, the legitimization of fetal personhood is the one thing that could take that little bit of protection away. And the logical conclusion of codifying fetal personhood into law is that women are being criminally prosecuted when their pregnancies do not result in live birth, whatever the reason for that miscarriage or stillbirth is. Over the last few years, we've seen women in the U.S. brought up on charges that they somehow caused their miscarriages. Bills criminalizing miscarriage have been proposed in several states, and in some, the courts have acted on them. In 2009, Nina Buckhalter was indicted by a grand jury in Lamar County, Mississippi for manslaughter. She was 29 at the time, and the decision says that she did willfully, unlawfully, feloniously kill Haley Jade Buckhalter, a human being, by culpable negligence. Nina had a stillbirth at 31 weeks. So the National Association for Pregnant Women has documented more than 400 cases across the country in which these laws have been used to detain or jail pregnant women for supposedly endangering their pregnancies. 71% of these are unsurprisingly likely to be low-income women. So we can again see the stratification of what actually happens when these laws are put into practice. They affect some of us a lot more than they affect a few of us. So this is what we have to look forward to if we continue to accept legal and medical regulation of abortion as the best that we can do and the best that we can hope for. So this is probably the most laughable of all the points I bring up. This has no bearing on reality. And the truth is that the passage of Roe codifies medical control of abortion into law and does nothing to guarantee access to abortion to women without means and privileges. The door to fetal personhood left open by Roe is increasingly leading to the prosecution of women whose pregnancies do not lead to to live birth. So we are accepting a fiction about what Roe does for us, but we're also accepting a fiction about why these restrictions are being enacted in the first place. And I think this is one of the more insidious and kind of amorphous lies that this narrative puts upon us. So the idea is that today, conservative politicians are restricting abortion access in a variety of ways due to the religious conviction that the sanctity of life begins at conception. So we get pundits saying things like this: to Republicans, abortion is about a deeply held moral belief concerning the sanctity of life, which propels them to legislate against half of the US population. So I think we're giving them way too much credit when we take their word on this. So when the men in power say something like this, which is in the Republican Party's official platform, new greenhouse gas regulations will harm the nation's economy and threaten millions of jobs over the next quarter century. Thinking people can look at this, recognize the hypocrisy, and call their bluff and see through to what they're actually saying. New greenhouse gas regulations will harm the ruling class's power to extract resources and threaten our profit and dominance, is what they actually mean. When the men in power say something like this is George Bush: confronting the threat posed by Iraq is crucial to winning the war on terror. We don't take this at face value. Really, almost no one does. It doesn't happen. What he's actually saying is this: confronting the threat posed by Iraq is crucial to maintaining the ruling class's power to extract resources and ensuring our profit and dominance. Call me jaded, but I don't think the men in power and the institutions they dominate, the military, the judiciary, the legislature, I don't think they do anything without this motivation. I think that every action they take is for the purpose of ensuring the ruling class's dominance and ability to extract resources. So when they say something like this is a Utah congressman: I am strongly pro-life and have fought to protect the rights of the unborn my entire career. I will continue to fight for this cause because I value the sanctity of all human life. Why do we take him at his word? Why are reproductive rights activists taking this and running with it? Why don't we call bullshit? We clearly can. People ask the question all the time: if they're so pro-life, why do they bomb children, sentence families to poverty, outlaw birth control, execute so many prisoners? It doesn't make any sense. It's because what they're actually saying is this: I am strongly pro-control and have fought to protect the rights of the ruling class to extract resources for my entire career. I will continue to fight for this cause because I value our profit and dominance.
Would you comment on? Can you comment on?
Let me get through this and I'll
see if we have time.
We'll do that. So liberal pundits and activists ask the question all the time: why are they doing this? But they ask it like it's rhetorical, like it can't possibly be answered, like it's just so absurd we can never possibly trace their motivations for these inane regulations. They say things like this: still, GOP bigwigs get furious when they're accused of conducting a war on women. But what else is it? It's clearly not a great moral crusade to save children. Well, you're right, Cynthia, it's not. But follow your logic to its conclusion, the same way that you would with any other issue. So liberal pundits and activists have taken to calling these abortion restrictions, birth control obstacles, and the like, a war on women, which is a term I actually like. But I think when most people use it, they seem to forget what war is actually for. War is hateful, but it's not about hate. It's violent, but it's not about violence. Its goal is control, but not control for the sake of control. The hate and violence of war are used to achieve control over resources and the ability to extract them. This is as true for the war on women as it is for the war in Iraq, the war on indigenous cultures, the war on the fabric of life on the planet, all of which we are seeing for the exact same motivation. Oppression is always tied to resource extraction, always. So since the very beginning of abortion restrictions in the US, which were trying to ensure the dominance of white people and of the current ruling class, and the dominance of the medical industry, which, again, represented by men, the ruling class, since further back than that, the very beginning of male hatred and control of women, something that we're getting very intimately acquainted with over the course of this conference, women and their ability to reproduce has been treated as a resource. Now, we may not like that it's treated that way, but my saying that does not make it true. Their actions make it true. So controlling women's reproduction is not just a hobby. It's not even just a religious directive, even though religion is used as a very effective tool for justifying this type of behavior. It's also not medical or scientific misunderstanding, which is another way that it gets phrased a lot of the time. This is not a mistake. This is not scientific stupidity. When Todd Akin says, oh, I forgot to put that slide in. When Todd Aiken says, "It seems to me, from what I understand from doctors, that's really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to shut that whole thing down." There is no medical debate about this. There is no literature, unless it's from an extremely off-the-wall right-wing publication, that says that this is true. These are also the people that say that climate change, there's a debate about that, but there is not. They'll invent a debate where it's politically useful for them, and this is just another example of that. This quote threw people into a furor. People were rightfully upset. But it's dangerous to write this off as medical misinformation or scientific stupidity. We hear them say this, and we let them off way too easy if we think that it's a mistake. So rape is another way to extract sexual and reproductive resources from female bodies, and they know it. Thousands of women become pregnant from rape every year, and men like Todd Aiken want those rapists to be able to extract reproductive resources from their victims the same way that they extract sexual resources. And any obstruction to that is seen as a threat to the fabric of society, which tells you about the type of society that they want to build. So we're not doing ourselves any favors by taking politicians at their word in terms of their motivations. In fact, by doing so, we're throwing the fight. So politicians are restricting abortion access in order to more effectively extract human resources from female bodies, with the added benefit of forced pregnancy further entrenching women's second-class status in every other way as well. And the conclusion of this narrative. Oh, there's that quote. We can successfully combat these restrictions through legal, electoral, legislative, lobbying, and public education tactics. So right now, the tactics being used against these restrictions include these things: legal, so suing them; electoral, trying to elect slightly less well-meaning politicians; legislative, trying to combat in a bureaucratic way the laws that they put forward; lobbying, so going and trying to convince politicians to not obliterate everything that women need to survive; and public education tactics, trying to educate the public about why this is necessary, why they should vote this way, lobby this way, make phone calls to their representative, whatever else. And the good news is that we have about as much public support as a resistance movement is ever likely to get. Recently in Texas, a state legislator named Wendy Davis undertook a talking filibuster for 11 hours against legislation that bans abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy, which is about 4 weeks before a fetus is viable, mandates that abortion clinics meet the same standards as hospital-style surgical centers, so a trap law. Also the admitting privileges thing, doctors need to have those, another trap law. What she did was impressive, but I'm more impressed by the thousands and thousands of people that came to support her, came to the Capitol and watched online in order to support her. That tells you how much support the side of sanity in this fight actually has. And this tactic worked for a few days. But a few days later, the governor called another special session, used outright deception to shut down debate, and late last night, the bill was passed by the Texas Senate with a vote of 19 to 11. So most of Texas's clinics are going to be shut down.
They also included rape and
What was that?
They also took out the exception for rape and incest. So women are now forced to have their relatives and rapist babies.
Say that again.
They also took out the exception for rape and incest in Texas. So even with examples like this being true, even looking at the outright failures of these tactics, I don't think we should stop using them. I think we need to use whatever has the least chance of working. And as I said, the women I admire most in the reproductive rights struggle are the ones living, eating, breathing, and sleeping this legislation and doing whatever they can to get in its way and to get in between the gears of that system. But I do think we need a diversity of tactics. We cannot accept just the tactics that are sanctioned, because by doing so, we accept failure. They're the sanctioned tactics by those in power for a reason. So those who oppose us are not restricting themselves to legal tactics. They're taking direct material action to stop us and to extract resources from women's bodies. Abortion providers themselves are becoming an endangered species, according to a recent survey of medical students for choice. Student members published in the journal Contraception, 33% of students reported no coverage of elective abortion-related topics. Only 50 U.S. medical schools out of 130 accredited institutions offer abortion training as part of their residency program. And the family planning training that does exist is often patchy and rife with misinformation. So when obstruction and lack of education can't get rid of all abortion providers, there's always terrorism. And the intimidation of physicians begins before they are even practicing medicine. In the spring of 1993, so this was a while ago, 33,000 medical students received a comic book in the mail from an anti-choice organization called Life Dynamics, titled Bottom Feeder. It contained dozens of jokes about abortion providers and being violent in nature. So, question, what would you do if you found yourself in a room with Hitler, Mussolini, an abortionist, and a gun with only 2 bullets?
Shoot the abortionist twice.
Thank you, Laurel. Shoot the abortionist twice. And plenty of people have taken this advice to heart and acted on it.
Right.
So since 1993, 8 clinic workers, including 4 doctors, 2 clinic employees, a clinic escort, and a security guard have been murdered in the United States. 17 attempted murders have also occurred since 1991. The effect of this is that it is terror. This is terrorism because doctors wear bulletproof vests. They have guns in their shoes. They come to work ready to die, and so do the clinic escorts, so do the medical staff, so do some of the women that come to get services there, whether it's abortion or a pap smear, because they're often performed at the same place. On January 1st of this year, there have been more than 6,400 reported acts of violence against abortion providers since 1977, including bombings, arsons, death threats, kidnappings, and assaults, as well as 175 reported acts of disruption, including bomb threats and harassing calls. The clinic I worked at never exploded, but not for lack of us being terrified of it. Every suspicious thing left on the sidewalk, everything the protesters left behind, every weird and creepy phone call was, assumed the worst. And that's even in places where these things have never actually happened, this is the climate that clinic workers and volunteers and activists and women live under. So this harassment is not limited to abortion providers. Women trying to obtain abortions are subject to what Rosalind Paczewski calls the cultural guerrilla warfare against abortions. So my home state of Florida has lovely, wonderful billboards with smiling white women with positive pregnancy tests. Pregnant? Your baby's heart is already beating. At a certain point, that's true, but that's also something that's used in a very emotionally manipulative and coercive way to get women to be scared of some of the options. The Choose Life license plates in, again, my home state of Florida are great. The purchase of those goes to crisis pregnancy centers in Florida, which are basically fake clinics. They do not have medical staff, they do not have medical services. They are often located right by reproductive health clinics, painted the same color, called something like pregnancy options, and they contain people who basically feed you a script. Sometimes they feed you fake ultrasound pictures and facts about pregnancy that are not true. The same as the state-mandated scripts that the doctors have to read that are not based on medical evidence that exists are basically what this plate does. And then they give you a pack of diapers and send you on your way because, yeah, that'll help with the next 18 years of being dependent for someone else. So there's a lot more than just the laws going on. Almost every day at the clinic I worked at, there were protesters outside. On special occasions, like the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, there were over 100 of them. Often they had loudspeakers where they kind of repeated these scripts and this emotionally manipulated stuff over and over, so loud that you could hear it in the waiting room, in the exam rooms. I can't tell you the number of women that took one look at that and kept driving and did not turn in for their appointments. They're not allowed to walk on the driveway in a lot of places. Clinton, one of the good things he did was the Clinic Entrance Protection Act, but that doesn't really matter because they will get their toes right up to the line and force literature full of medical misinformation into the edges of your car door and on your windshield and whatever else. So they would yell at the women, often at the men, saying, "Why do you let her go in there? If you were a real man, you'd drag her out." But they also take pictures of them. So when we're at a porn conference, I think that's probably more meaningful than I even found it at the time, because that was one of the most terrifying things to these women, is that they would be on film doing something that these people were telling them was shameful and evil and would mark them as evil for the rest of their lives. So as clinic escorts, we often carried umbrellas because we couldn't shield them from the shouting or the trap laws, but we could at least shield them from the cameras some of the time. Couldn't shield ourselves, unfortunately. They developed nicknames for most of us to kind of harass us the entire day. So there are an ever-expanding amount of creative legal ways that legislators in the courts are using to restrict access to abortion, but their movement, unlike ours, is not restricting itself to legal tactics. And to be clear, again, I don't think we should stop using legal tactics. We need anything that can work. And we do have a large degree of public opinion on our side. There are some things that are happening now that are direct action, so abortion funds, donating to funds that directly allocate money to women who are in need so they don't need to go without food or sell their possessions or fall into prostitution, as many have to. Clinic escorting, so making sure women can actually get into the building. Again, since the Clinic Entrances Protection Act, this is a little bit easier than it was during the early 90s, but there's still a lot of intimidation and fear that goes along with even women just being able to walk into the building. And providing medical care. I think what reproductive health clinics are doing, as much as I can criticize the medicalization of that industry, is direct action. They live under a climate of terrorism in order to do that every day. Not only the doctors, we give a lot of focus on the doctors, but the many, many, mainly women that are nurses and receptionists and security guards and police officers that help with this are under that same climate. But I don't think that this is enough. I think that as long as we're using the tactics that they have sanctioned for us, we're dooming ourselves to failure. Like any fight, if we play on their turf, we're throwing the fight. And I think that we need to look back. We need to look back to earlier reproductive rights movements that knew that any regulation was an indicator of how not safe that right was. That as long as they had our bodily autonomy as a bargaining chip, they would use it to control us. And that's exactly what's happening now.